Hi, Jan Recker.
Hi, Nick.
All right, so yesterday I was talking to a group of executives, and we were talking about. I had a presentation. It was a virtual, and there were a whole bunch of CIOs. And one of the topics, apparently, that my the person who invited me mentioned is that they were discussing last time is the difference between digital and IT. All right, we have both of these words, digital and IT. And apparently there's something different with digital, or at least a lot of people are pushing it. And I'm one of those researchers, right, who's written papers on digital innovation and I use the word digital. So I figured at the start of my presentation, I would address this topic of digital and IT. And it was kind of a fun thing. So I figured I'd talk to you about that today. Uh,
Well, I'm curious what you did. Did you say something like, "Look, it is the same, or it's not the same, or it's just a different word for, what did you present?"
well, I'll tell you what I presented in the end, my argument, but let me start. Let's do this fun. Let's start by making the argument for there's no difference. All right, in its strong form. And
Mm-hmm.
then maybe we'll turn around and I'll try to sell you on the idea that it's different. All right. So let's start by making the argument that it's not different. And I would have to say about, I don't know, 30 seconds into my presentation, I got a guy. He's from the oil and gas industry. He was an executive. And he immediately chimed in and said, yeah, but isn't this what we've been doing all along? Right. And of course, I had that like many slides down the pike, but I basically said that if you look at it substantively, what is IT about? Right? And what has IT always been about? It's about generating organizational value with, digital technologies, generating organizational value with software, data, and computers, right? Uh, that's what IT's always been about. And then if you think about what's digital about, well, generating organizational value with digital technologies, right? Software, data, computing. So it stands to reason that things like development, things like implementation, all the stuff we know, all the stuff we do, governance, it translates directly. So the
Yeah.
fundamental argument is there's no difference, right?
Well, you could see it this way, I guess. I mean, in this sense, IT or digital is both just computing, isn't it? You take
Yep.
some technology which inevitably actually has to be in some digital format, right? Except for the very very first computer that used these sort of stance cards. But anyway, so technology these days is digital. So and it's really about representation and computation then. And then from that point, it's the same. And I guess then the difference in why we now talk about digital is really just a language game. The idea that we, over certain circles in certain ways, we just change how we talk about things. In science, but also in the general public discourse and in the media and so forth. It just, the same thing. And we've seen it before, right? If you consider the big debate that was just before that, which was about change versus transformation, you know, or in process redesign versus process improvement. People have argued that there are certain differences in degree, but really it's the same thing. So you can
Yeah.
make that argument that just every now and then we just update our language, I guess. And then the question is whether that's a meaningful thing to do, and maybe it is because it's powerful.
Language, it's just how it's just, well, language can be powerful, but isn't it just framing? Aren't we just salesmen, right? One is it's selling the same wine in a different bottle, right? It's
But that's the
superficial.
power of it. I mean, that's the power of it. If every now and then there's ways of framing. There's terms that we use, and they get out of fashion. They get outdated, and they don't have any buying power, so to speak, anymore. You can't get anyone interested, which is a problem for businesses that try to sell you stuff. But it's also a problem for academics that we try to sell our ideas and our problems also to an audience, right? And so if you reinvent your problem by choosing a different framing that just speaks to the audience a bit better, that can be very powerful. So if everyone wants to hear about digital these days, well, I'll call it digital, even though to me it's the same thing as IT maybe or some other or computing.
So So this is what I'm hearing. If we're talking to people in industry, just because it's got kind of more cachet, we use the term digital. But when we're looking at our research and extending research conversations forward, you know what? It's the same thing it's always been, which is computing in the world and in organizations, and what we know about computing will indeed translate. Is that pretty
Well,
much what you're saying?
that could be an argument. A one that is complementary to that is also it would be a good thing if it were the same. In fact, even if we change our language a little bit, but we still mean the same thing, that would be a good thing because that would lend some sort of history and cumulative tradition to the field. That we say, well, now we talk about the digital, but really, in essence, we still talk about computing, to generate value. I think that was the idea, right? Computing or technology to generate value. That's been our thing for 50 years. Now we name it digital, and in the past we used some other term for it. But, we would still have a accumulated tradition. Because if it were really all the way different things, then, we would endanger that tradition because we would, be in a different field, wouldn't we be?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And actually, a couple of years ago at Academy of Management, I don't know if you know Abayomi Bayer.
Yeah.
He's AB. He's the guy at Copenhagen Business School, right? He's super
Very, very
ambitious.
productive.
Yeah, super ambitious young guy. And he
Very.
got a bunch of us together. Ola Henfredson was there with Young Jin and me. He got Raghu Garud and Bob Heinings, who's an institutional guy, along with some others, Michelle Avital and Philip Turcher, who's there in
In
Amsterdam.
Amsterdam. Yeah.
And we had one of those symposia that AB put on where he's like, do we need new theories or are the old theories fine for digital? And we set it up. It was kind of fun because half of us argued, no, actually, all of the theories still apply. And then half argued, no, there's something different here and we need new theories, right? Frankly, I can't remember which side I was on, but I remember attempting to provoke. Actually, my side was that anything we know just doesn't matter anymore. My argument was that everything we know is predicated on the industrial age, and if you think about it, management schools were created in the industrial age. Frederick Taylor, the time and motion guy, right, who created Wharton and all the other business schools that started propagating all throughout the 1900s, it came out of the industrial age, right? Before that, there were no management schools. There were military academies and that sort of thing, but there wasn't industrial management as a area of scholarship or of education, and that's when it happened, right? And throughout, and it was entirely rooted in the industrial age. In the industrial age, its core technology was the factory, right? The core technology for production in the industrial age was the factory. And previous to that, the core technology for production was the farm, right? In the agricultural age. What happened is the farm gave way to the factory. Farms were still important, but now, industry mattered more. As a matter of fact, industry started propagating across farms. We got industrial
But here
agriculture.
I gotta jump in here real quick. Like here you talk about technologies, but you mean neither information technologies nor digital technologies. Now a factory, especially one in the late 19th century, that wasn't based on IT or it wasn't digital either. Same as the farm. These were technologies, but not the technologies that, for example, our field would be interested in.
Again, when you say the word technology, I'm talking about it in its broadest sense, the technique,
Yeah,
the
like a procedure
physical,
for doing stuff.
the procedure, right? And the
Yeah.
procedure involves its material elements. And a farm isn't just, a farm involves, cows and horses and tractors and whatever else, seeds. And there are material elements of that technique as well. And it's the core technique of the agricultural era was farm of some form or another,
But that doesn't
right?
necessarily, yeah. But that doesn't
And
necessarily make it an artifact that's of interest to information system scholars, for
well,
example.
but
We
that's
don't
my
look
whole
at
point.
all
So,
types
so you're
of
making my
technology.
argument for me. The technology, the core technology was the factory of the industrial age. The entire management discipline, anything about management came up using that, the idea of the factory as our reference, right? Porter's value chain. That's what we thought of as an organization. That's how our factories were organized, right? There was an operations group, there was maybe sales, there was accounting, there was finance. Finance was very much concerned with whatever capital asset pricing model and other stuff. And that's and you know what happened? IT in that context was a support organization. If you look at
Yeah.
Porter's Porter's value chain, technology is a support organization like human resources, right? Human resources isn't the real work, but of course we need people. So we need some sort of mechanism to support the real production that we do with the right people. Same with
And
IT. IT
yeah,
is not what we do. We make something, and IT supports that we make that thing. We still had this mindset of the industrial age, right?
that
And
that
all of our knowledge, so I'll let you talk in a second, sorry, but all of our knowledge comes from that, right? And my argument in that AOM session was, since now our technology, the core technology through which you generate value is, as you said, software, computing, data, uh, everything we know actually doesn't hold anymore because there's a new technology. And just like industrial age toppled agricultural, digital is toppling industry.
yeah, okay, because I wanted to point out that what you're saying here is the position that he held there and all the arguments he just gave. To me, they don't fit the narrative that digital and IT and all technology is the same. You're actually
Yeah, so I
making
think I
arguments
made the
where the
opposite
difference
argument.
exactly. So let's get back to that in a second. Before I wanted to quickly ask, at these symposia, sometimes in these debates you get assigned roles. So I wanted to ask you, was that a role that you held, or was did AB or someone else say, Nick, you got to be the opposing guy. Your view is going to be
Yeah.
X, and you elaborate on
Mine
that.
was opposed to Bob Heinings, right? Who's the institutional guy. And he wrote a recent paper in Information and Organization, probably a year or two old at this point, where they basically said, look, here's kind of a institutional perspective for digital transformation. So here's how we can reconcile kind of everything we know about institutions with digital transformation. And, these are all kind of institutional elements, right? So I think Bob made the argument that, wait a second, IT people, there's this whole world of institutional theory that can explain what you're seeing in the context of digital transformation. You don't need new theories. This is just an instance of current technologies and how it's always been and can always be made sense of in this kind of institutional framework.
Yeah, but in this institutional frameworks have that. Well, they always say you can explain anything with this, which is its advantage and disadvantage at the same time. I mean, I can basically apply institutional frameworks to explain anything. Same, by the
Yeah,
way, I can take general systems theory and do the same thing.
right.
And in a way, I can even take socio-technical systems thinking and apply that to anything. In this sense, then digital IT and other types of technologies, they're just, I can, if I talk about them as tasks and structures and rules and so forth, then everything's just a socio-technical system, which is what these grand theories at that level of abstraction what they do. I mean, that's exactly what they do. They apply to everything and they lose a lot of detail, I think, right?
Yeah.
Um,
But,
so
but let's, well, all right. So there's the grand theory, and yes, you can apply it and it holds. And then there are the specific implications of the theory. So let me give you a perfect example. And of course, this was not a nuanced presentation. I was kind of being theatrical, and I told them no, anything we did, because our institutional tradition is steeped in industry and in the industrial age, none of it still holds, right? So that was my provocation. But in reality, there are things that we take as assumptions in institutional theory that I don't think exist anymore. And a perfect example is the idea of industrial field, right?
mm,
In institutional theory, one of the core constructs, DiMaggio and Powell and whoever, they have this idea of an industrial field. And it's basically an aggregation of organizations. So you might say the healthcare field. So you'll immediately know who that is. That's hospitals, it's pharmaceutical companies, it's whatever, right? Doctor offices. And you can immediately think of the types of organizational actors that are in that field. Similarly, you might say something like banking, right? And now we know who's in banking. It's banks. It's you get the idea. And what I think, and you see where I'm going with this already, don't you? Right? That in the digital age, who's doing your banking? Well, Alibaba is the number one payments company in the world, right? Who's doing your healthcare? Well, whatever, Nike Fit and Under Armour has the biggest app for yeah, that sort of thing. So it's this idea of digital convergence. It's this idea that in the past we had industrial fields. We don't anymore. Airbnb is your biggest hospitality platform. That we don't have industrial fields. We have these platform ecosystems, and it's a different thing.
well, I would qualify that a little bit. I think the fields still persist and they still exist. Yeah, sure. There's still something like a tourism sector, but it's been, sort of converging, as you said, or it's been intersected by stuff like Airbnb and others. So before we get there, I wanted to make one more point about this. You mentioned Porter and the role of IT as a sort of like an enabling component. You also got to say, at that time, especially up till the late 90s, early 2000s, the evidence that we had supported that view, right? You remember the productivity paradoxon type of studies that showed, oh, look, if you invest heavily in IT, that doesn't necessarily change the game. So all the evidence at that point said, well, it really is an enabler, and therefore it depends on what you do with it, right? And I think always the epitome, which is sort of it was my entry point, I think, into research, was this article by Nick Carr, who wrote IT Doesn't Matter.
Yeah.
And, and he had some evidence and points to it, right? So at that time, it there wasn't a lot of evidence that would be otherwise. And I think the question then is, well, I think now the reality is different, and I agree that certain assumptions from that time don't hold anymore. But then we got to ask, okay, what changed, and when did it change? And how did it change? Because no one would say the same thing anymore. I mean, if you come up and say IT doesn't matter at the moment, people would laugh at you, right? Rightfully so. Yeah. So it doesn't have any face validity anymore. But back then it did, right? Remember, this was after the year 2K. Yeah. Bug or not bug as it may be. There was the e-commerce bubble crash. We had a decade long of people or organizations trying to implement SAP with no apparent benefit. So, there was a lot of evidence that, it wasn't as simple as you guys buy SAP or you guys buy Microsoft and your business, your value proposition will prosper. So, so at that time, and that's not a long time ago, it's sort of 20 years ago. So I have some theories around what happened sort of in the years that followed, which I use in my executive teaching, sort of very non-researchy, to say, well, these are the things that change that.
Let's pause and what's Nicholas Carr's argument, right? He says IT doesn't matter. He didn't really say exactly that. That was the title of his paper. But what was the substantive argument he made? Do you remember?
Oh, geez. At the
he
moment,
basically, this is my recollection, that it was that IT is a kind of a competitive necessity, right? It's not something where if you don't have it, you'll fall behind because you need a certain amount of efficiency, but you're not going to get competitive advantage of IT. So his suggestion, and again, I'm just remembering this, is to kind of treat it like a utility. Make sure you're running it efficiently, make sure you're doing what industry standard practice is, but don't go leading, because you'll just waste a whole bunch of money, right? That's what I remember. Was that?
Yeah, he made it a hygiene factor, right? Like a Herzberg hygiene factor, and said, well, if you don't have it, your performance will drop off. But if you overinvest, you're not going to get much,
Yeah. And his idea was thinking of it as a utility, and the idea was, all right, it is SAP, right? It was ERP, it was productivity tools, it's all the so. All right, cool. Now, what do you think changed? And of course, the critiques at the time. Kale, my advisor, wrote a response, and there were a number of other people who wrote responses in various journals and said, well, their argument was basically IT is not one thing. It's many things, and it's this evolving frontier of things. So maybe you're looking at a certain type of IT and saying that, but you can't say that about the evolving frontier. And there were other such arguments, right, that tried to say it's not a utility.
Well, I think when I talk to executives about it, so the context in which I talk about this topic is really around, what's different when we talk about innovation now, right? What's different about digital innovation? So it might be similar to what you did when you talk to your executives as well, right? So, often I talk about, different generations or different waves of innovation. And I basically make the argument that, well, around 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10, that's sort of the time frame we're looking at. This is where really this new wave of innovation started, and where some of this digital technology really came into fruition and generates, what we now see and why we now think that
you're thinking like smartphones in 2008, right? That's when
that's one of them. Apple first iPhone in New York, people camping in front of the store in 2007, right? And then the rise of the iPhone and similar smartphone adoptions that started then. At the same time, sort of ubiquity, right? So that around the same time, we had people not only just having a a personal computer, which they had for about 10, 15 years, but we had mobile computers, we had mobile devices, and we had multiple of them. That also started around that time. The third one that I always say is the connectivity between users. So the examples of Facebook,
Yeah.
Twitter, Instagram, the social networks. So the fact that you could connect people on an unprecedented scale, so into the billions, which was unheard of at that time.
Yeah.
And the fourth one is sort of
It's Smack. You know, you're recreating Smack. You know this.
pretty much, yeah, right.
Smack,
So
Social
Smack,
Mobile
yeah,
Analytics Cloud. Yeah, because big data was about 2010,
that's
right?
right,
The,
and
the word big
that would
data
be my
and data
fourth.
scientist.
The big data and the sort of data availability generativity. The fifth one that I always say is there's also a tipping point in the number of objects versus people on the planet that are connected, right? So around
Mhm.
2008 was the tipping point where we, for the first time, had more connected electric or digital objects than people on the planet. And, ever since it's been rising exponential. So these are the
And
things,
then
and they all fall into the same time frame between the sort of second half of the first decade of the 2000s.
Yeah, and then right around then, maybe 2012, the data scientist, according to Harvard, was the sexiest job of the, yeah, 2012. I just looked it up. Sexiest job of the 21st century, right? So what you're doing is you're marking kind of 2007 to 2012 as the era that SMAC emerged, right? Which is Social Mobile Analytics Cloud. And then that's when it took on this different complexion. Well, I would propose to you that that's not where I think it's 1995 and that there was just a lag. And here's why I say 1995. And you kind of alluded to both of them. The first is that's when the internet went widespread,
Yeah.
right? The second is that's when personal computers, in the early 90s, nobody had a computer in their house. By 1998, 99, most Western wealthier households had computers in their home. That's when the huge diffusion happened of computers and the internet. And then we got our Amazons and our eBays, and we had MySpace, and you had all the predecessors. So that's why I mark the mid 90s as the beginning of the digital age as opposed to later. I thought what you saw with Smack was people were figuring it out now, right? But some smart companies figured it out a decade or so before, right? And then, of course, the mobile end hit, as you said, right? In that period. But to my sense, there's a lag, right? And even now, I think we're in the very early stages of artificial intelligence, right? We might, in a decade or so, be in the golden age of, or 2 decades, be in the golden age of reinforcement learning and market then. But I think now the last 5 years has really been sowing the seeds for a lot of what we see. So I would put it mid 90s is when
Okay. You know what?
the digital age started.
I think we both agree. We might disagree on the timing, but I think we both speak to the same fundamental mechanisms, right?
Yeah.
So everything that I mentioned builds on internet connectivity, for example, which it started in 1990s, etc. So everything that I say, I think has a lot to do with a diffusion and pervasiveness outside of, let's say, outside of typically confined containers where we used to have them. We used to have computers in back offices for a couple of decades, right? So the
Yeah.
banks
Oh, sure.
had mainframe computers at least since the 70s, yeah, if not the 60s. But it spread. So that's the same argument, and of
Well,
course
and the
you
key
could say
point
that
is
the
back
90s,
office.
yeah,
So that's your
back
key
office,
point,
yeah.
because if you just said we've had it in the back office forever, and that would be my argument. In the industrial age, you had computers supporting the real commerce, the real activity of the organization, and the computers were in the back office. They were facilitating processes. Uh, with the internet, with computing at home, you now moved it to the front office, and that's e-commerce, right? Remember, e-commerce late 90s, early 2000s was actually a term. Now it's just commerce, right? But this e-commerce was this idea that now we're moving computers to the front office. And that's when yeah, I think that is the difference. So right up until 1995, which is the productivity paradox, right? That stuff was all written in the 90s. Right up until then, that's because IT was back office. It was support. The moment the internet, personal computing, e-commerce, and then later mobile, Smack, all of that happened. It took a 15-year transition. That's the mark of the beginning of the digital age that changed business, and it's changing business right now. And my provocation was that nothing we know holds anymore, which I would argue is not true because we learned a lot. but we have to adapt it to this new context where the core technology driving value is. And that's my point about digital. Uh, and by the way, I just want to reconnect with one point before about fields and how it's field convergence and everything. There is a guy, his name's Andrew Hoffman at University of Michigan. I first discovered his work in 2008. He wrote a book, or he wrote a book chapter on fields and institutional fields. And he argues that DiMaggio and Powell kind of have this container view of fields, where an industrial field is a container, an aggregate of organizations. And what he's saying is, yeah, that's not the view anymore. It's now these cross-field practices, right? It's like fields of practice. It's something like that, right? And I think that's far more of a friendly way to think of platform ecosystems rather than containers of organizations, right? So if I were to steer, and that's what I think's happening, is that a lot of our core, maybe institutional theory, there are still institutions. We, of course, through our practices and our language and our material, technologies, we reenact them and then they evolve and all of that.
Which is also why, this notion of disruption is so misleading, I think, because the institutions, they're converging and they're sort of breaking up a little bit, and the boundaries become porous, and other stuff can move in between, but they still persist, because institutions is not as simple as technology breaking down the containers and opening it up, like I'm shooting a box and it has holes everywhere. Right? Because an institution has more stuff. It has laws, it has regulation, it has norms, it has history, and so forth. So all these practices, which are, number one, very slow to change and very hard to change, right? So we saw this here in Europe, for example, with the advent of Uber and how differently that moved in comparison to the States. So here we just, they just passed a law and it was illegal, right?
Yeah.
So it still came in and diffused, but way slower. And the impact on, let's say, the mobility field or the hospitality field wasn't as, stark, so to speak, as it was in the States, right? So I wouldn't worry too much about the institution. That's why I'm saying that there's still fields and they'll persist for some time, because their technology is one piece of the configuration, right? And that opens up the whole array of really interesting questions, such as the relationship between laws, let's say, and social practices that are historically grown, and then technology that's way more rapid and fluid and changing all the time. It creates tensions everywhere, right? We see this all the time when we have digital advances like the internet, and the legal side in countries or in conglomerates like the EU or on the global market, they have trouble catching up.
Yeah, totally.
Right? So we see this all the time. I wanted to ask you a different thing. So we seem to agree basically on some of the fundamental mechanisms. So we also seem to agree that there is a difference. And the difference seems to be not in degree, but in kind, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I do. I think so. And I think your earlier statement about language, I was trying to kind of move it to, it's just superficial, it's sales. But right, language is constitutive of our experience.
Absolutely.
And I would argue that using the term digital is not some incidental salesy, fashion, if you will, where now we just take the same wine, put it in a different bottle, and it's the same thing. I think that we need to use the term digital. And the reason we need to use the term digital is because IT signifies the IT department. And the IT department in a lot of organizations is SAP, it's process improvement, it's security, it's reliability, right? It's architecture, right? We need to fit into our enterprise architecture, right? So it's this very conservative, traditional in a lot of organizations. In some organizations, particularly if they report to the CFO, right? There's the paper by Rajiv Banker and some other people where they talk about if your CIO reports to your CFO, then you're a cost center and you're not innovative, right? If you're your IT group. So I think that's the situation. We're in this place where, digital technologies are part of IT. Not everyone is the Hilti CIO, right? Jan van Broek has that interview with the Hilti CIO. Now this guy he's a digital innovator, right? They're changing the way you relate to power tools, right? In construction. So Hilti's super cool, but not all of them are like him. Most of them are we do the SAP.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so when in my work with the CIOs in Australia with Woolworth, for example, the CIO was a classical CIO, and he was very aware of that. He said, "Look, I became CIO because I managed for years to roll out Oracle and SAP throughout 4,000 supermarkets. No problem. I'm really good at this." But now I'm being asked to be a profit center, number one, not a cost center anymore, and they ask me to be innovative, and I
Hmm.
cannot, my IT department cannot do this, and I personally cannot do that either, right?
Yeah,
He can't just, you can't adopt an agile mindset. You can't build little, I don't know, little mobile apps for shopping customers, because what he's trained and what his whole institution, his the IT department does is to very careful and risk averse safe
yep,
implementations of back office operations, because that's what they've
exactly.
been tasked to do for 20 years. So
And
he
now the
saw it coming
marketing
that
group,
they, that's right.
marketing group wants an app. This other group wants to do some data analytics, right? We want to start putting cloud capabilities in our product. And, the IT department is not equipped to do this. The other groups want to do it. So what is digital? Digital is when you need to separate it from IT, right? It's not the IT. The IT is what the IT department does. Digital is what our entire organization does, right? And then it matters.
Can I go back, because before I lose that train of thought, because you said this really interesting point about, well, everything that we know, all of our theories, in the provocative statement you said, is sort of we can throw it out of the window. But I think what you mean is we got to carefully evaluate where and to what extent they still hold in this
Right.
new age, right? And I wanted to say, isn't it a very exciting time? I mean, that's great. If I were, let's say, a beginning PhD student, that gives me so much freedom. I can make many arguments. I can argue for grounded theorizing and saying, oh look, the old stuff doesn't matter. I gotta start inductively. I gotta go out, see what's happening now, and theorize from this. Or I can do a very deductive way. I can take TAM, I take some other very established theory from back then, and then carefully apply it to what is going on out there and make modifications to it. I mean, for Scala, that's really, I give you two different scripts and both of them will work,
Yeah.
right? And
Well, and
that,
a lot
that,
of
that
these
was
new
different.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of new people. So what they end up doing is chasing whatever blockchain or fintech or whatever it is. They go after a domain and they kind of ignore the fact that, well, what's blockchain? It's a distributed database. What are we really, let's take everything we know and what is the key distinction, right? Instead of doing that, everything I know is new is blockchain, right? So they don't read the old stuff that maybe would have applied, right? So that's the one issue there. The other issue is, do we really want a TAM paper on sometimes we've beaten up these old theories so much that yeah, I guess.
But you gotta say that like if you think about it this way, adoption now is a different phenomenon from the late '90s. I mean, TAM was invented by they studied the adoption of email in organizations, because that was a thing in the late '80s, and the
Yeah,
in word processing system, right? I'm not talking about Microsoft Word. They had
yeah,
I can't even remember what they were called, like the predecessors of Word, and that was the thing. And you can't take these arguments, and they don't explain an adoption, let's say, by the latest social media app, Clubhouse. It has
yeah.
nothing to do with usefulness and ease of use, right?
No.
And it's a very different scale too. So there's got to be room to do research on adoption. And if you do that, it puts you in this difficult position that, well, you can't just ignore 30 years of technology adoption research, but at
Yeah.
the same time, you also know that that's not gonna be it. So you got to deal with that in some sense. But all I'm saying is, I think it is a good time to revisit some things that we thought were done, dusted, or settled, or confirmed, so to speak, because
Yeah.
probably not, right? So that's a
And
nice thing.
maybe that's one argument, but the other argument. So if you look at, you said adoption just now. If you think of TAM, its original formulation was acceptance. The whole idea of acceptance means someone's giving you something, and do you accept it or not? The very foundation was that management was trying to get people to use this technology and go from paper to PFS write or whatever, uh, right? And how do you get them to do it when you want them to, right? And that's the idea of acceptance. I would argue that that idea of acceptance has taken on a different complexion to the point where you instinctively use the term adoption instead, right? Because it's far more voluntaristic and it's far more, yeah, there's some acceptance, but I think it's just it's become a different problem fundamentally. in the sense that so that we don't want to use the same language necessarily. So we end up
Yeah.
ignoring tan, which we probably should.
Well, that would be a nice way out, wouldn't it? I mean, like, you could invent a new term because it is a fundamentally different thing. I don't think that any of the problems around adoption and diffusion at the moment have anything to do with acceptance. So that goes back to the point of saying, well, that's a good thing that we can update our language. So yeah, I wanted to jump on a different thing, and I wonder what do you think about this? See, one of the things I like in this debate that we're having at the moment, which other people have had before us, about is this old wine in new bottle or not? What's the difference between digital and IT? You mentioned AB. There's this paper that came out by Laurie Wessel on what the difference is between IT transformation and digital transformation, right? So we, by no means the first. So what I like about all these discussions is I think they're bringing us closer to the question of what is the ID artifact, or what's the artifact that we're interested in. I think these discussions about, okay, what's different here about the digital age? My impression is that over the last 10 years, as we grappled with this, has brought us much closer to the question of, well, do we have an artifact and what it is and so forth, than any of the work prior, including, the famous 2001 paper on the ID artifact in eyes research, right, by Olikovsky and Iacono, right? So if I look at that, I was like, oh, gee, that's so simple. That's so simplistic, right? So I think a lot of the nuances that have been coming out, by Yang Jin when he talks about certain characteristics of digital technologies that are new, or the work by Lowry or AB and others, I think we're getting closer to finding out what is the ID artifact, which I like, and I realize that not everyone likes even thinking about this discussion.
All right, I just thought of something. So Woodward, way back in probably the 50s, wrote about the different types of technology for industrial production, right? The batch processing, continue. I forget. They're the main, and then that gave rise to kind of the whole contingency theory kind of branch in a lot of ways, where depending on what you're doing is how you structure. I wonder if what you're getting at, since the core technology of the digital age involves software, data, and processing. I wonder if there's some sort of similar kind of core technology, some sort of typology of artifacts, core technologies of the digital age. No one's talked about this, but there's maybe some sort of contingency, or maybe we're not evolved yet, because if you think about it, Woodward wrote that, the industrial age had already been going for about 180 years at that point or more. Right. So you can really, they had settled. I think, right now we're in the emerging phase. Nothing has
maybe we are, but see if we're on the same page, because I'm not sure I follow you. But so Woodward, I think what he had was an empirical typology, right? He said, well, he has basically 5 different types of technologies. There's batch processing, there's...
First of all, I think it's a woman, Woodward, right? Wasn't she? Wasn't it Joanne Woodward? Or... So I think you're a sexist, just assuming...
or just an ignorant... So what I meant to say is, like, I think that was just, okay, that was a, probably useful classification, right? Fairly empirical. See, what about, isn't what you just mentioned about, well, we don't have that yet. What about this work by Faulkner and Runde, on the digital object? I mean, isn't that going into fundamentally working out what are artifacts, what are objects, what are digital objects, what's the relationship of material elements in it and immaterial and so forth? Isn't that what you just said we need?
Well, I don't think they gave a typology really, and maybe we should. What they did, all right, they gave a structure. They gave essentially an ontology for thinking about digital. So they gave us a language which we may or may not agree with, right? And other people. So, for example, in the paper you mentioned, right, I forget, but they talk about material versus non-material, right? And even the way they use the word material contradicts, say, Leonardi's use of the word material, 6 years earlier. So it's like these are not somehow non-controversial constructions that they're putting out there. I generally am against. I like the idea of using language for a purpose, not using language kind of like Moses with the tablet saying, okay, here are the laws, right? I felt like some of these papers come down with here is what is, kind of in Young Jin's recent Digital First article with Baskerville. I mean, these are good things. People like them. They'll get cited a lot, but it's more of it's here's what is.
Yeah. See,
Tell me why you're giving me what is, and then we'll see if it's a useful way of divvying up the situation.
well,
I think that why is missing in some of these articles.
it probably is, but you got to say there is an appetite. There's an appetite in the field for the what is type of articles, for definitional articles, with all the good and the bad things that come with this. I think the field, and I mean really, hundreds and thousands of people and their papers. That's why these papers get cited so much. Is they want that others define the language that they can use. They want to, they basically look for an ontology that we don't have, right? So they're really happy if some guy comes out and says, look, guys, here's this thing, and this is how it's different from that other thing, right? I think there is just this appetite in this field. Maybe it stems from the fact that we don't have an ontology, let's say, like medicine, right? Because the things that we're dealing with, they are so fluid and changing and fast paced. It's really hard to grapple with any of this. So maybe that's it. The downside, with which I agree, is that unfortunately, as soon as we have one of these papers, it gets used as a template, especially by reviewers, and saying, "Oh yeah, oh well, you're talking about this. Well, you gotta put it into this language. You gotta fit into this ontology somehow. And if you don't, then that's bad." It's the same thing that we have when we have procedural templates for doing types of research, right? We've seen this with design science. Hefner said there's 7 steps to it. There's got to be 7 steps to it, right? So that's a bad thing. We always do this. What is always gives templates, and then people somehow coerce other people to use this template. It makes it really hard to follow a different script, right? And that's a problem. I see that. Yeah.
All right, so I think we came up with a bunch of good future conversations, including ontology versus no ontology, right? I think, and we have some others here. You brought up grounded theorizing, and we have some others, but let's go back to our core point, and tell me if we're in kind of agreement here. IT is a signifier, and to a lot of organizations, it signifies what the IT department does. Since we're in the digital age, we have that transition. A lot of organizations are realizing that we need to do this shift where IT is everywhere in the organization. It can't just be the charge of the IT department. And the way they're making sense of this shift where we need this widespread use of it, they use the term digital, and that distinguishes from IT. At its core, no substantive difference. Therefore, we might be able to take a lot of what we know and adapt it. But there is a substantive difference because of the situation we're in, right? And we are in the digital era.
Agree. And let me just jump into one of these points. I think there is a substantive difference, and it's not just vested within the technology itself. It's also within, you mentioned the organization. Well, it stretches beyond that. So the context has shifted. So organizations not only have to deal with what their IT department does or whether other departments also dabble with technology, like marketing, sales, and operations, but they also have to worry about the fact that from the outside world, from everyday users in other organizations and third-party complementers, also technology is coming in a good or in a bad sense. It could be attacking, complementing, etc. Right? So this is not a question of the technology. This is the context. It's just expanded significantly, right? So which I think makes it interesting. So you can't boil it down to it's different because the software has gotten smarter or because there's more data, but also because more people have it, more people use it. It's literally everywhere, well beyond work. I find that always interesting. This blurring from organization to private parts, etc., and so forth. So and that's where the difference is.
Woodward is Joan Woodward. I googled it here. So it is a woman. You are a sexist.
I am a sexist. I'm a European sexist that has done ethical mishaps, as we explained last year.
We explained last time. You're a trainer.
Because I'm European, yeah.
Oxford University she was, so she was indeed probably European herself. Anyway, all right. Record.
That was good, I think. I think we got, first time we actually got to some sort of conclusion, right?
Yeah, we'll do it again.
We'll do it again next time. All right, Nick. Bye.
Bye.